The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat quietly in her private study. The weight of recent months pressed heavily on her shoulders, the constant media scrutiny, the endless royal obligations, and the growing pressure to maintain a perfect public image had begun to take its toll. She had always been the picture of grace and composure, the woman who smiled through every public appearance, who never let the world see her struggle. William had left early for a series of meetings with palace officials, leaving Kate alone with her thoughts and a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. The silence of the palace corridors felt overwhelming today, echoing with the weight of expectations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. She had been trying to prepare for another public engagement, another smile to paste on her face, another performance of the perfect princess. The stack of briefing papers on her desk remained untouched as she stared out at the palace gardens, watching the groundskeepers tend to the perfectly manicured lawns. Everything in their world had to be perfect, controlled, measured. There was no room for weakness, no space for the kind of vulnerability that ordinary people could afford. She thought about her children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and how she desperately wanted to protect them from the suffocating pressure that came with their birthright. Her phone buzzed with another message from her private secretary, reminding her about the upcoming charity gala, where she would need to give a speech about mental health awareness. The irony was not lost on her. Here she was, struggling with her own emotional burden while being expected to champion the cause of mental wellness. The weight of hypocrisy felt crushing, even though she knew her advocacy work was genuine and important. Catherine closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of honest reflection. She had married the man she loved, but she had also married into an institution that demanded everything from her, while giving little room for her authentic self. The woman who had once been free to laugh loudly, to make mistakes, to be imperfect, had been carefully molded into a symbol of perfection that sometimes felt foreign to her own identity. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made her quickly compose herself, straightening her shoulders and arranging her face into the serene expression that had become second nature. She expected it to be one of the staff members with another request or update about her schedule. Instead, she heard the familiar sound of William's key in the lock of their private quarters, his return much earlier than expected. Catherine quickly wiped away the single tear that had escaped during her moment of reflection, not wanting to burden her husband with her emotional struggles when he carried so many responsibilities of his own. She had become an expert at hiding her feelings, at being the supportive wife and devoted mother while keeping her own needs carefully tucked away. The sound of William's footsteps grew closer, and she prepared to greet him with her usual warmth and composure. But as she heard him approach the study door, something inside her felt different. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of maintaining her facade, or maybe it was the overwhelming need for someone to see her as she truly was, not as the world expected her to be. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to let her guard down completely, to show her husband the depth of her struggles without fear of adding to his burdens. The doorknob turned slowly, and Catherine held her breath, not knowing whether she would be able to maintain her composure, or whether this would be the moment when her carefully constructed walls finally crumbled. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was waiting to see what would unfold when William stepped into the room and looked into his wife's eyes. William pushed open the study door, expecting to find Catherine reviewing her notes for the afternoon's engagements, perhaps making final adjustments to her speech or coordinating with her team. Instead, he was met with something that stopped him in his tracks. His wife sat motionless by the window, her usually perfect posture slightly curved, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together through sheer will. The morning light revealed what she had tried so desperately to hide. The slight redness around her eyes, the way her jaw was set with tension, the almost imperceptible tremor in her shoulders. For someone who had spent years learning to read people, to understand the unspoken communications required in royal life, William immediately recognized that his wife was struggling in a way she rarely allowed herself to show. Catherine looked up as he entered, and for a split second her guard was completely down. In that instant, William saw not the composed Princess of Wales, not the confident mother who handled every crisis with grace, but the woman he had fallen in love with at university, vulnerable, human, and carrying a burden that she had been shouldering alone. The mask she wore so expertly for the world had slipped, revealing the emotional exhaustion that had been building for months. She quickly attempted to compose herself, straightening her shoulders and arranging her face into a smile, but it was too late. William had seen the truth, and something in his expression told her that this time there would be no pretending, no brushing aside her feelings with assurances that everything was fine. The silence between them stretched for several heartbeats, filled with years of unspoken understanding and the weight of shared experiences that only they could truly comprehend. William closed the door softly behind him and approached slowly, as if sudden movements might cause her to retreat further behind her protective walls. He had seen Catherine handle impossible situations with grace: hostile media attention, family, crises, public scrutiny that would have broken most people. But he had also learned to recognize the signs when the pressure became too much, when his strong, capable wife needed someone to simply acknowledge that she was struggling. The irony of their situation was not lost on either of them. They were surrounded by staff, advisors, and security. Yet in moments like this, they were utterly alone in their unique position. No one else could truly understand the weight of living under constant scrutiny, of having every gesture analyzed, every expression photographed and dissected by millions of people around the world. The isolation of their roles sometimes made their bond the only refuge they had. Catherine's attempt to speak was interrupted by the emotion she had been suppressing all morning. The words she had prepared to explain away her state died on her lips, and instead, she found herself unable to maintain the pretense any longer. The weight of being perfect, of never showing weakness, of always being on, finally became too much to bear alone. Her carefully controlled breathing became shallow, and despite her best efforts, tears began to form in her eyes. William recognized this as one of those pivotal moments in a marriage when words would be inadequate, when his role as husband had to take precedence over his role as future king. He had learned over their years together that Catherine's strength was both her greatest asset and sometimes her greatest burden. She gave so much to everyone around her, their children, the charities she supported, the people who looked up to her, that she rarely left anything for herself. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, highlighting the tension in Catherine's shoulders and the way she held herself so carefully, as if relaxing might cause everything she had built to crumble. William stood there for a moment, understanding that his next actions would determine whether she would feel safe enough to finally let go of the burden she had been carrying, or whether she would retreat back behind the walls that protected her from a world that demanded perfection from its princesses. In that moment, suspended between her vulnerability and his recognition of it, the future of their private world hung in the balance, waiting for someone to bridge the gap between the public personas they wore and the real people they were underneath. Without saying a word, William moved across the room with the quiet confidence that came from years of knowing exactly what his wife needed, even when she couldn't express it herself. The distance between them seemed to hold the weight of all the unspoken pressures they both carried. The expectations of a nation, the constant scrutiny of the media, and the impossible standard of perfection that had been placed upon their shoulders from the moment they said their wedding vows. Catherine watched him approach, and in his eyes she saw something that had become increasingly rare in their world: unconditional acceptance. Not the careful political calculations that governed so much of their public life, not the measured responses that were crafted by teams of advisors, but the simple recognition of one human being seeing another in a moment of genuine need. The tears she had been fighting finally spilled over, creating small dark spots on her cream-colored blouse. William knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level in a gesture that spoke volumes about his priorities in that moment. The future King of England was on his knees, not in submission to protocol or ceremony, but in recognition of his wife's pain. His hands found hers, and the contrast was striking, his warm and steady, hers cold and trembling despite her efforts to maintain control. The study around them seemed to fade into the background as they created a bubble of intimacy in the middle of the formal palace setting. The official portraits on the walls, the ceremonial objects that reminded them constantly of their duties, the stack of briefings that awaited their attention, All of it became irrelevant in the face of this purely human moment. Catherine's tears came more freely now, each one carrying months of suppressed emotion. She had cried before, of course, but always in private, always carefully managed so that no trace would remain when she next appeared in public. This felt different, rawer, more honest, and somehow more frightening because it was happening in the light of day, in the space where she conducted the business of being a princess. The careful compartmentalization she had mastered was breaking down, and with it, the protective barriers she had built around her most vulnerable feelings. William said nothing, understanding that sometimes the most powerful communication happened in silence. His presence alone was enough to tell her that she didn't have to carry her burdens alone, that it was safe to let go of the control she maintained so rigidly. His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands, a small gesture that conveyed more comfort than any words could have managed in that moment. The tears that fell were not just about one particular crisis or challenge, but about the accumulation of years of putting everyone else's needs before her own. They were about the weight of representing something larger than herself, about the loneliness that came with being constantly watched and analyzed, about the fear that she might never be enough for the role that history had assigned to her. Each tear was a small release of pressure that had been building for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Catherine's breathing began to slow as she allowed herself to feel William's presence fully. The man who had courted her with such patience and understanding was still there, still willing to be her anchor in the storms that their life inevitably brought. The prince who could command rooms full of world leaders was content to sit quietly with his wife, offering nothing more than his unwavering support in the sanctuary of his understanding. The morning light shifted slightly, casting new shadows across the room, but neither of them moved. Time seemed suspended as Catherine finally allowed herself to be fully seen, not as the Princess of Wales, not as the mother who had it all together, not as the woman who never showed weakness, but as herself, complete with all the fears and struggles that made her human. In that silence, a conversation was taking place that was more honest and meaningful than many of the formal discussions they had with advisors and officials. It was a dialogue of presence, of recognition, of the deep understanding that comes when two people who have chosen to face the world together remember that they don't have to face it alone. As Catherine's tears continued to flow, William found himself remembering their early days together, before the weight of royal duty had settled so heavily upon their shoulders. He thought about the young woman he had met at university, full of laughter and dreams, who could spend hours talking about everything and nothing, who wasn't afraid to challenge him or disagree with his opinions. That woman was still there, he realized, but she had learned to hide herself behind layers of protocol and public expectation. The silence between them was filled with understanding that had developed over years of navigating impossible situations together. William knew that Catherine's tears weren't just about today's pressures, but about the gradual erosion of the carefree person she had once been. The transformation into the Princess of Wales had been remarkable to witness from the outside. Her poise, her dedication, her natural ability to connect with people, but he had also seen the personal cost of that transformation. Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. The words she spoke weren't about specific events or particular stresses, but about the feeling of losing herself somewhere between the person she had been and the person the world needed her to become. She talked about watching their children navigate their own unique challenges, knowing that she was preparing them for a life that would demand everything from them, while rarely giving them the freedom to simply be themselves. William listened without trying to fix or minimize her feelings, understanding that what she needed most was to be heard without judgment. He knew the peculiar loneliness of their position, surrounded by people yet isolated by the very nature of their roles. Even their closest friends couldn't fully understand what it meant to live under constant scrutiny, to have every decision analyzed and criticized by strangers who felt entitled to opinions about their private lives. The conversation that emerged was unlike any they had shared in recent memory. Catherine spoke about the moments when she felt like an imposter, despite years of experience and countless successful public appearances. She described the exhaustion that came from always having to be on, from never being able to have a bad day in public, from the pressure to be a perfect role model for millions of people who looked up to her. William shared his own struggles with the weight of expectation, The way his future role as king sometimes felt like a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. He talked about his fears for their children, his concerns about the world they would inherit, and his own moments of doubt about whether he would be the leader his country needed. In sharing his vulnerabilities, he created a space where Catherine could feel less alone in her own struggles. The morning progressed around them, but they remained in their bubble of honesty, finally having the conversation they had both needed, but hadn't known how to initiate. Catherine spoke about the criticism that cut deepest, not the attacks on her fashion choices or public speaking style, but the suggestions that she wasn't working hard enough, wasn't contributing enough, wasn't worthy of the position she held. The perfectionism that drove her to excel also made her vulnerable to every piece of negative feedback. William recognized in his wife's words his own internal battles with criticism and self-doubt. The difference was that society seemed to scrutinize her more harshly, to hold her to standards that were both impossible and constantly shifting. He had grown up knowing his role from birth, while she had chosen to enter this life as an adult, fully aware of what she was signing up for, but perhaps not prepared for the emotional toll it would take. As they talked, something began to shift in the atmosphere of the room. The weight that had felt so crushing to Catherine began to feel more manageable when shared. William's presence and understanding reminded her that she wasn't facing these challenges alone, that their partnership was strong enough to weather the storms that their unique life brought their way. The tears that continued to fall were no longer just expressions of pain and overwhelm, but also of relief at finally being able to voice the thoughts and feelings she had kept carefully hidden. In William's acceptance of her vulnerability, she found a reminder of her own strength, not the artificial strength of never showing weakness, but the real strength that comes from acknowledging struggles and facing them with support and love. The conversation gradually evolved from tears and whispered confessions to something deeper and more constructive. William and Catherine began to talk about practical ways to protect their family's emotional well-being, while still fulfilling their duties to the crown and the people they served. They discussed the importance of creating boundaries, of finding moments of genuine privacy where they could simply be William and Catherine, rather than the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in their formal roles. Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that was so natural and unguarded it reminded William of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. She wasn't crying from weakness, he realized, but from the strength it took to carry so much for so long without complaint. Her tears were not a sign of failure, but evidence of her deep care for everyone and everything she was responsible for. Their children, their causes, their country. They talked about their children's futures with a new honesty, acknowledging the unique challenges that George, Charlotte, and Louis would face as they grew older. Catherine expressed her determination to give them as normal a childhood as possible, while still preparing them for the responsibilities they would inherit. William shared his own memories of struggling with his royal identity as a young person, and they both committed to being more open with their children about the complexities of their situation. The discussion turned to their public work and the causes they championed. Catherine realized that her advocacy for mental health awareness had perhaps prepared her for this moment in her own life. The recognition that seeking support and showing vulnerability were signs of strength, not weakness. The irony that she had been helping others understand this truth while struggling to apply it to herself was not lost on either of them. William suggested they find ways to bring more authenticity to their public appearances, to let people see glimpses of their real selves rather than maintaining the perfect facade at all times. They talked about the possibility that their honesty about struggles might actually make them more relatable and effective in their roles, rather than diminishing their authority as they had always feared it would. As the morning progressed, Catherine began to feel lighter, as if sharing the burden had literally made it less heavy to carry. The problems hadn't disappeared, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Having William's full attention and understanding reminded her that she had chosen her life partner wisely. He was not just the future king, but a man who could sit with her in her darkest moments and help her find her way back to the light. They made practical plans for managing the immediate pressures Catherine was facing. William volunteered to take on additional responsibilities so that she could have more time to process her emotions and regain her equilibrium. They discussed the possibility of adjusting their schedules to allow for more family time, more moments of connection that could sustain them through the challenging periods. Catherine looked around the study that had witnessed her breakdown and felt a shift in her relationship with the space. Instead of feeling like a prison where she performed her royal duties, it began to feel like a place where real conversations could happen, where she could be honest about her struggles without judgment. The official portraits on the walls no longer felt like reminders of impossible standards, but like representations of people who had also faced challenges and found ways to overcome them. The transformation in Catherine's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders were no longer rigid with tension. Her breathing had returned to normal, and while her eyes were still red from crying, there was a clarity in them that had been missing when William first entered the room. She was beginning to look like herself again, not the perfect princess, but the strong, capable woman who happened to be a princess. William recognized this shift and felt his own relief at seeing his wife emerge from the emotional storm she had been weathering alone. Their marriage had always been their refuge from the pressures of public life, but moments like this reminded them both of the importance of actively nurturing that refuge, of creating space for honesty and vulnerability, even when the world demanded constant strength and composure. As they sat together in the morning light, both of them understood that this conversation had been necessary not just for Catherine's emotional well-being, but for the health of their marriage and family. They had rediscovered something essential about their relationship, the ability to be completely honest with each other, to show weakness without fear of losing respect or love. The afternoon brought a gentle rain that seemed to wash the world clean outside the palace windows. Catherine and William had spent the morning hours in their private sanctuary, but now the outside world was beginning to intrude again with its demands and expectations. However, something fundamental had shifted between them that made those pressures feel more manageable than they had in months. Catherine stood and walked to the window, watching the rain create patterns on the glass. She felt different, not because her circumstances had changed, but because she no longer felt alone in navigating them. The conversation with William had reminded her that vulnerability and strength were not opposites but partners, that showing her struggles to the person who loved her most was not a burden, but a gift of trust. William joined her at the window, and they stood together looking out at the gardens that would soon bloom again with the spring. The metaphor was not lost on either of them. Sometimes things needed to appear to die back in order to grow stronger. Catherine's emotional breakdown had felt like an ending, but it was actually a beginning, a clearing away of pretense that would allow something more authentic to grow in its place. They talked about the afternoon's scheduled appearances and how Catherine felt about facing the public again. To her surprise, she found that the prospect didn't fill her with the same dread it had that morning. Having been seen and accepted in her most vulnerable state by the person whose opinion mattered most to her, she felt less concerned about maintaining a perfect image for strangers. The mask she wore for public appearances would still be necessary, but it would no longer feel like a prison. Catherine realized that her tears that morning had been not just about the pressures of royal life, but about the loneliness of feeling that she had to face those pressures without showing any sign of struggle. William's presence and acceptance had broken through that isolation, reminding her that she had a true partner in this extraordinary life they had chosen together. The crown might be heavy, but it was a weight they could share. The rain began to lighten and shafts of sunlight broke through the clouds, creating a rainbow that arced across the palace grounds. Catherine smiled for the first time that day, a genuine expression that came from a place of peace rather than performance. William saw the change in her face and felt his own relief deepen. His wife was finding her way back to herself. They made plans for the evening, simple domestic arrangements that grounded them in their identity as a family, rather than as public figures. Catherine wanted to help the children with their homework, to sit at the dinner table and listen to their stories about school, to read bedtime stories and tuck them in with kisses. These ordinary moments of motherhood were what sustained her through the extraordinary demands of her public role. William suggested they take a walk in the gardens after the rain stopped, just the two of them, without security hovering close by or photographers documenting their every step. They needed these moments of normalcy, these pockets of time when they could simply be a husband and wife who loved each other, who supported each other, who found joy in small things despite the magnitude of their responsibilities. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine began to prepare for her evening engagements with a lightness she hadn't felt in weeks. The same events that had filled her with anxiety that morning now seemed manageable, because she was approaching them from a place of authenticity rather than performance. She would still need to be gracious and composed, but she no longer felt the crushing pressure to be perfect every moment. The transformation was visible in her posture, her expressions, the way she moved through their private quarters. William watched her with admiration, seeing again the woman who had captured his heart not with perfection, but with her genuine warmth, intelligence, and compassion. The vulnerability she had shown him that morning had not diminished her in his eyes, but had reminded him of all the reasons he had fallen in love with her. They stood together in the doorway of the study, where their morning of honesty had unfolded, both understanding that they had turned a corner in their relationship and in their approach to the challenges of royal life. The room looked the same, but it would forever hold the memory of the morning when Catherine's tears had spoken truths that words couldn't express, and William's presence had provided the safety she needed to finally let go of the burden she had been carrying, alone. The palace around them hummed with the activities of staff, preparing for the evening's events. But William and Catherine remained in their bubble of renewed connection for just a moment longer, savoring the peace they had found together and preparing to face whatever challenges awaited them, with the strength that came from truly knowing they were not alone. Evening fell softly over Kensington Palace, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to permeate every corner of William and Catherine's private quarters. The children had returned from school full of energy and stories, their innocent laughter filling spaces that had felt heavy with unspoken tension just hours before. Catherine found herself genuinely present with them in a way she hadn't been for weeks, able to listen to their chatter without the distracted worry that had been her constant companion. At dinner, the family gathered around their private table, away from the formal dining rooms where state occasions were held. George excitedly recounted a football match from school. Charlotte showed off a drawing she had made in art class, and little Louis entertained them all with his attempts to tell a joke he had heard from a classmate. Catherine laughed, really laughed, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the sound surprising even herself with its spontaneity. William watched his wife interact with their children and saw the difference that their morning conversation had made. The tension that had been evident in her shoulders for months had eased, and her smiles reached her eyes again. She was fully present, not performing the role of mother, but simply being one. The authenticity that had emerged from her vulnerability was transforming not just her relationship with him, but her connection with their entire family. After the children were settled for the night, William and Catherine prepared for their evening engagement, a charity gala for mental health awareness that had seemed impossible to Catherine that morning, but now felt like an opportunity to speak from genuine experience. As she dressed, Catherine realized that her approach to the evening had fundamentally changed. Instead of worrying about saying the right things and maintaining a perfect image, she was thinking about the people who would be there, the stories they might share, and how her own journey through struggle might help others feel less alone. Standing before the mirror, Catherine saw herself differently than she had that morning. The woman looking back at her was still the Princess of Wales, still carried all the responsibilities and pressures that came with that title, but she was also someone who had been seen in her vulnerability and found that she was loved not despite her struggles, but because of her humanity. The tears she had shed had washed away something that had been blocking her authentic self. William appeared behind her in the mirror, adjusting his bow tie with the practiced ease of someone who had attended thousands of formal events. But his eyes met hers in the reflection with an intimacy that transcended the formal clothes and official duties. They shared a look that communicated everything: gratitude, love, understanding, and a renewed commitment to facing their challenges together rather than in isolation. The car journey to the gala was different from the tense, silent rides they had shared recently. Catherine found herself talking about the evening ahead with genuine enthusiasm, sharing ideas about connections she hoped to make and conversations she wanted to have. William listened with pleasure, hearing his wife's natural warmth and intelligence shine through, without the careful scripting that had characterized her recent public appearances. At the gala, something remarkable happened. Catherine's speech about mental health awareness was delivered not from prepared remarks crafted by speechwriters, but from a place of authentic understanding. She spoke about the importance of seeking support, about the strength that comes from admitting vulnerability, about the way isolation can make any challenge feel insurmountable. Her words resonated with the audience because they came from real experience, from recent personal understanding of the truths she was sharing. The evening progressed with Catherine engaging more naturally with guests than she had in months. The conversations felt genuine rather than performed, and she found herself truly listening to the stories people shared, rather than simply waiting for appropriate moments to respond with prepared phrases. The connection she had reestablished with her authentic self that morning was allowing her to connect more meaningfully with others. William watched his wife throughout the evening with pride and relief. The woman he had married was fully present again, not the perfect princess who never struggled, but the compassionate, intelligent, genuine person who happened to wear a tiara. Her brief moment of breakdown had actually made her stronger, more connected to herself and therefore more able to connect with others. As they returned home that night, Catherine reflected on the unexpected journey her day had taken. What had begun with overwhelming despair and isolation had transformed into renewal and reconnection. The tears that had felt like defeat that morning now seemed like the beginning of a more authentic way of living within the constraints of royal life. The palace settled into quiet around them as they prepared for bed, but the silence now felt peaceful rather than oppressive. Catherine understood that challenges would continue to arise, that the pressures of royal life wouldn't disappear, but she also knew that she didn't have to face them alone behind a facade of perfection. William had seen her at her most vulnerable and loved her more, not less, for her humanity. In the sanctuary of their bedroom, away from public eyes and royal duties, they were simply William and Catherine, two people who had chosen to build a life together and who had rediscovered that their love was strong enough to hold space for both strength and vulnerability, both the crown and the heart.